We So we have the pleasure of having Dr. Sade Brown with us. So Dr. Sade Brown is a chemist and an organic polymer scientist who specializes in commodity polyolefins and polyesters, pulp, and paper or forest products, engineering plastics, bio-based plastics and chemicals, environmental protection, agency regulations, technical writing, standard operating procedures, material testing, product development, and product formulation. She earned a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry, the American Chemistry Society certification from Winston-Salem State University, and a Master's of Science in Chemistry, Biochemistry from North Carolina Central University. Following the completion of her master's studies, Dr. Brown then earned a Doctor of Philosophy in organic chemistry with a graduate minor in polymer chemistry from Clark Atlanta University. Dr. Brown has provided consulting services to the chemical and allied industries. In addition to providing consulting services, she has led research studies on the effects of organic containments in local surface water, primarily in African American neighborhoods. In the context of understanding health disparities in a cohort with the EPA, Dr. Brown has been extensively investigating how these leachable chemicals, such as organic contaminants, affect our overall health from what we eat to the utensils we use. As an expert in polyolefins and product development, product formulations, pharmaceutical and medical device industries, she helps clients solve problems in chemical manufacturing with an emphasis on developing or improving processes. She has over 8 years of diversified consulting experience in the chemical industry. Dr. Brown's experience includes solving challenging real-world problems, including failure analysis, reliability, and safety of engineered systems. Additionally, she has a well-developed understanding of materials, testing, and characterization, and is highly skilled in a range of analytical and experimental techniques. So we welcome you, Dr. Brown, and we are going to turn over this presentation to you on the history of vaccinations and involuntary testing on African Americans.
Appreciate you. So again, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I will be presenting on the history of vaccinations of involuntary testing on African Americans. This presentation will include the history of African American mistrust in medicine, corresponding to African American medical history, African American health disparities in modern times, what should we know about vaccines and vaccinations, how racial disparities are emerging in the treatment of COVID-19 today, and as we look at current times, what is COVID-19 and what can we do to actually make this better? So as we look at the history of African-American mistrust in medicine, we see that Black people have globally suffered a long legacy of poor medical treatment as well as questionable practices in the drug development. U.S. medical establishment has a long legacy of discriminating as well as exploiting Black Americans, which lies deeply embedded in the collective conscience of the community. So looking further at vaccinations, right? We see that the first school vaccination requirements were enacted in 1850s to prevent smallpox. And as we move forward, the federal and state government actually eradicated measles in the 1960s and 1970s. And this actually created modern mandate policies. So in the 1990s, 50 states actually required students to receive certain immunizations. So if you have children, you know that when you go to daycare, you have to submit the immunization sheet in order for them to stay in daycare or actually start daycare. But it's also important to know these vaccines are licensed and added to the immunization schedule after they have been researched as well as been tested and reviewed by the National Vaccine Program, which and other key vaccine committees like the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, also known as ACIP. As we think back in history, one of the most memorable events we tend to reference is the Tuskegee study. This was when the U.S. Public Service began the Tuskegee study in 1932 in Alabama. It recruited up to 600 Black men. 399 were actually diagnosed with syphilis, and 201 were a control group without the disease. These men told they would be treated for syphilis, but later learned that the study was to actually look and see if the untreated syphilis progressed differently in Black Americans as compared to the federal government never intended for these participants to get the treatment, which was penicillin. However, even though it became readily available in 1943, as we moved on, we saw that at least 28 and perhaps up to 100 men died from syphilis in 1932. Some men went on to affect their wives, as well as pass it down to their children. You see the picture on the right actually shows men who actually participated in the experiment. And this is part of the photos in the National Archives. Still looking back in history, in 1783 through 1861, which was the antebellum period, we saw that African Americans were actually forced to participate in dissections as well as medical examinations. This means they actually dug up Black bodies, robbed us from our graves, and did surgical and anatomical experimentation. Also during that period, psychiatrists actually diagnosed runaway slave syndrome with called drapetomania. It's really hard for me to say that. It was actually created to diagnose and treat African slaves who actually fled their slave owners. So basically, a runaway slave was considered a disease, or they called it, to run away from slavery was considered as a disease. And they treated this by often amputation of extremities. So to move forward, during the Civil Rights era, which many of you may know of, during 1914 to 1951, segregation and discrimination, as well as poverty, led to extreme rates of sickness and mortality among African Americans as groups such as churches and community organizations actually fought in March for healthy conditions through the National Negro Health Week. They fought for things like infant health stations, nutritional programs to help curb maternal and infant mortality. And even psychiatrists during that time actually portrayed Black activists as violent, hostile, and paranoid because they threatened the status quo. So they diagnosed them basically with schizophrenia. To the right of the slide, you see there is a picture showing the Medical Committee for Civil Rights on the March of Washington in 1963. And Henrietta Lacks is the reason for many medical achievements today. As a cervical she had cells taken from her without her consent before she died in 1951. They discovered that her cells was immortal, meaning they could proliferate. These cells are still used to pioneer many drugs and treatments used today. Her cells have been shared worldwide along with her medical records and any information about her family and genetics. It was only in 2013 where her family actually gained rights or control over her information and what they can be used for. So I actually want to share this really amazing video on how medicine's dark history helps explain why Black mothers are dying at alarming rates. Please let me know if you can hear it.
At the edge of Central Park in Manhattan, there's a bronze statue of a doctor named James Marion Sims, whose brilliant achievement carried the surgery throughout the entire world. He's the guy who created the vaginal speculum, an instrument gynecologists use for examination. He pioneered the surgical repair for fistula, a complication from childbirth, and became known as the father of modern gynecology. But that brilliant achievement was the result of a series of excruciating experimental surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
That's Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author who chronicled the intersection of race and medicine in her book, Medical Apartheid. While many of the stark racial disparities in healthcare can be attributed to environmental and economic factors like access to good healthcare, studies show that minority patients tend to receive a lower quality of care than non-minorities, even when they have the same types of health insurance or the same ability to pay for care.
As African Americans, we've been abused for so long, consistently by the system. Why should we trust it? Why should we go to it when ill? And that's iatrophobia. That's a fear of the healer, inculcated by the behavior of those healers, unfortunately.
It starts with slavery. Doctors relied on slave owners for financial stability. Verified the fitness of slaves and were called in to treat sick slaves to protect their owners' investments. In 1807, Congress abolished the importation of slaves and in turn pushed Black women to have more children, to essentially breed slaves. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson later wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm." Around the 1830s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, or efforts to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there were polygenists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolve from different origins. The 1830s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. One doctor performed experimental C-sections on slaves. Another one perfected the dangerous ovariotomy, or removal of an ovary by testing the procedure on slave women. 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments on Black people. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves. His practices echoed one of the most prevalent and dangerous beliefs in medicine at the time, that Black people did not feel pain or anxiety. This book from 1851, titled The Natural History of Human Species, claimed the American dark races bear with indifference tortures insupportable to a white man. Studies released as recently as last year demonstrate that Black people are less likely to be treated for pain, particularly in the ER. There's even one from a children's hospital that found the same to be true for kids. And just this year, Pearson Education, a leading educational publisher, issued an apology and recalled nursing textbooks that included racist stereotypes, like this section that said Black people often report higher pain intensity than other cultures.
Well, what does it mean when you say that someone doesn't feel pain? Among other things, you're speaking about their humanity. These are all part of that suite of beliefs emanating from the 19th century that we still have not shaken off. Despite all our knowledge and sophistication, they're deeply ingrained.
Doctors like Sims might fit the Dr. Frankenstein stereotype, but they weren't outliers. Historically, other doctors who used Black bodies for troubling experiments were the norm.
It's a very common question. How can we judge our forebears? Those guys in the 18th century practiced medicine in a way that appalls us today. And we think, how could you do that? I did not judge the practitioners based on our own ethics. I judged them based on the ethics of their time. It was not acceptable back then. We just did not hear from the people who protested against it.
After the Civil War ended, the 1900s brought a wave of immigrants to the US. It sparked a race panic and coincided with the birth of the American eugenics movement. One of the movement's key objectives was to reduce the childbearing potential of the poor and disabled. Leaders included birth control pioneer and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who eventually devised the controversial Negro Project, or family planning centers that pushed birth control in the Black South. It was a project that even garnered support from W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, who wrote that Black people bred carelessly and disastrously. By the mid-1930s, more than half the states passed pro-sterilization laws, and often sterilization was forced. In 1961, future civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer went to the hospital to have a tumor removed, but was subjected to a hysterectomy without consent. The procedure, which rendered women infertile without their knowledge, was so common in the South that Hamer is said to have dubbed it the Mississippi appendectomy.
African-American babies were no longer economically valuable. And African-Americans themselves had gone from being a resource to a nuisance.
In June of 1973, the SPLC uncovered 100 to 150,000 cases of women who had been sterilized with federal funds in Alabama. Half the women were Black. In recent decades, women of color continue to be exposed to dubious reproductive health programs. In December, approved a contraceptive called Norplant, and it was selectively marketed to Black teenagers in Baltimore schools.
One of the current birth control methods now in the United States is Norplant.
Norplant fans like David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard, even introduced legislation to give women on welfare an annual reward of $100 if they agreed to get Norplant.
And it's time we start to encourage welfare mothers to be responsible.
That bill never passed, but the implant ignited a debate on whether long-term contraception, like Norplant that lasted 5 years, could be used as a form of social engineering when pushed to specific communities. Today, as we continue to lose Black mothers at alarming rates, a deeper look at the past may be a good step towards creating a more equitable healthcare system.
Okay, so I hope that gave you guys some context.
At the edge of
And now we move forward to the question, why are Black women at such high risk of dying from pregnancy complications? Well, it is noted that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes, and this is than white women, and this is stated by the CDC. And again, this is because a lack of access, poor quality of care is dependent on your socioeconomic status. We're undervalued, and the implicit bias and structural racism that still exists in the medical system today. So if we then look at this chart, we see, if we then look at this chart and in the modern times, we see that African Americans have the same diseases as our white counterparts, but they are much more likely, we are much more likely to die sooner. So if we look at this chart here, we see that this is deaths per 100 people. The red color represents African Americans and the white color represents white Americans. So African Americans are more likely to die at early ages from all cases. So it doesn't matter the age, we're still most likely to die or more likely to die for all diseases. We're three times more likely to die of asthma than Caucasians, 25% higher cancer death rates than Caucasians, 20% higher cancer death rates for Caucasian women as compared to African-American women. And we develop chronic diseases earlier in life, which actually shape the I'm sorry, I can't even say it, which basically shortens our life expectancies. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you so much. When compared to Caucasians, I sometimes trip over my words when I'm reading fast. Modern times, as we look at the health disparities, even in the ER, we experience implicit bias. So from that, we see that Black patients are more likely than whites to receive a lower triage score for the same complaints. So basically a triage personal rate is basically the complaints are basically less serious. So what does that mean? So less serious complaints in the ER basically translate into longer wait times. Longer wait times are not good for people who actually have experienced a stroke. So basically in that case, where time is actually important, Blacks experience long wait times for stroke medications. So after we experience our long wait times, we then experience where physicians spend less time with us or less time with Black patients when compared to whites. They also are are less likely to perceive the patient as being honest, regarding as shown to in past history complaints as well. As we look forward into modern history, we also see that Black Americans with mental health disorders are also less likely to receive certain medications for certain conditions as compared to our white counterparts. We are less likely to be prescribed the better medications. So for instance, we saw that clozapine, which is considered the Cadillac for psychiatric medicine, actually Black patients were less likely to be prescribed this medicine, and even though they were diagnosed with serious mental illness when compared to white patients. And then we get into why vaccines. So after talking about the history of African Americans and going into the modern Americans, look at why vaccines. So germs are all around us in both the environment and in our bodies. So when a person is susceptible, they encounter a harmful organism and it can lead to a disease and or death. So we have these physical barriers that present these pathogens, right? So some of these physical barriers are considered skin, mucus, and cilia, which is basically microscopic hairs that remove debris away from your lungs. So when a pathogen actually infects your body, your body defense system, which is your immune system, triggers and the pathogen is attacked and destroyed. So a vaccine is basically something that stimulates a response against a foreign pathogen. It's used as a preventative measure, and it can train our immune systems to create antibodies that fight against the foreign pathogens. And they work. So a vaccination is when you have a health official actually administer the vaccine to a person to prevent against the disease. So for instance, a vaccine is a type of medicine that makes you resistant or immune to the disease like polio. So this is why we do not see many cases of polio existing, because most of the world has been vaccinated. So here's a nice little diagram showing you how vaccines work. So you'll have an existing pathogen, or which could be the measles, the flu, or chickenpox. So a pathogen is basically a bacterium or a virus or a parasite or a fungus that can cause a disease within our body. So each pathogen is basically made up of several subparts. Right, and the subpart of the pathogen causes like the formation of antibodies, which is called the antigen. Antibodies produce the response to the pathogen's antigen and are more important part of the immune system. So you can consider antibodies as like our soldiers in our body's defense system, and each antibody or soldier in our system is basically trained to recognize one specific antigen, and that could be the flu, measles, or whatever, or COVID-19. So we actually have thousands of different antibodies in our bodies today if you have been vaccinated. And when the human body is exposed to an antigen for the first time, it takes time for the immune system to respond and produce antibodies to that specific antigen. So this is basically the antibodies that are actually being produced that actually can interact with the actual antigen. So once the antigen-specific antibodies are produced, they work to rest in the immune system to destroy any pathogen or basically stop the disease. So as we move forward, and in given weeks or months apart, and we see that with COVID-19 with the Moderna as well as the Pfizer vaccine. Sometimes this is needed for the production of long-lived antibodies and the development of memory of cells. In this way, our body is basically trained to fight specific disease-causing organisms, such as COVID-19, or when we're exposed to a specific pathogen in the future. So again, a vaccine is not dangerous. It's just a tiny, weakened, non-dangerous fragment of an organism, and it includes parts of the antigen. And it's enough that our body can learn this and build from this specific antigen. So I guess you want to know what to know about vaccines and vaccinations. Well, vaccines are basically responsible for many global public health successes. The eradication of smallpox and many other things such as measles and polio. But then we see that vaccinations have long been subject of various ethical controversies. So when we talk about vaccine regulations, even today, development, and then the development includes mandates, research and testing, informed consent, as well as access disparities. By that, mandates are, well, to look a little further, mandates are basically used in the United States as state policies to mandate certain immunizations. Currently, again, to reinstate, certain immunizations are required for your child to actually go to school or for you to enter college. So when we move on to research and training, all vaccine development and research process have diverse experts, many scientific and includes public health, epidemiology, immunology, statistics, as well as the pharmaceutical companies. So it's important to understand a vaccine's safety and efficacy in various populations. So this is why, if you look back at the news from 2020, you see that these different companies were requiring a wide sample of people to actually, as well as age and ethnicity, to actually enter into the study so that you'll have better data. And then we have access issues. So access issues could come from socioeconomic status. So you'll have people who are, this is an example, this is like a businessman and this is like a farmer. So his income would be more than the average farmer, or he's more educational as compared to the average person who may be poor. Quality, he may have better educational quality, social support, security, health access, while this person may not have as much. So this is where socioeconomic status comes in. And then you see racial ethnic minority status. So we assume that all lives are equal. However, opportunities are not protected by the government for us when it comes to vaccination. And researchers have found that the racial ethnic minority adults are less likely than Caucasians to actually receive preventative care, including vaccinations. And then we move on to informed consent. So I don't know if many people know this, but federal guidelines do not require written consent before vaccination. And the National Childhood Vaccine Energy Act in 1986 requires that doctors or their parent legal representatives a vaccine information statement. So the vaccine information statement is basically, it shows the vaccine's risks, benefits, and they're designed to provide information for patients/parents to make informed decisions. So as we look forward, now that we know about vaccines and vaccinations and all that's required and all the testing and mandates that go into them, let's look at how the immunizations in African Americans have panned out. So for the flu, which is, influenza, we see that in 2019 and 2020, non-Hispanic Blacks age 65 and older, if you look down here, were 10% less likely to have received the influenza shot as compared to Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic whites age. It's the same for here. So it's also, these are for adults ages 18 and over who actually received the shot in 2019 and 2020. As we move on, we see for the immunizations for pneumonia, we also see that non-Hispanic Blacks ages 19 to 64 up here, and ages 65 and older were 2% and 16% less likely to receive the pneumonia vaccine as compared to non-Hispanic whites. So the trend here is that more non-Hispanic whites are receiving immunizations as compared to non-Hispanic Blacks, whether it be flu, pneumonia, or hepatitis, as well as HPV. So we still see that non-Hispanic Blacks ages 19 to 26 are still less likely to receive the HPV vaccine. So I guess you ask yourself, is it no surprise that African Americans do not trust medical professionals? So trust is not only the foundational element between a doctor and a patient relationship, it's also vital before the patient even goes into, it's also vital making the decision to seek help before the disease actually onsets. So in order to address the distrust in the US healthcare system, there must be exploration of historical roots and how implicit bias as well as structural racism operates in the modern medical context. So Bill Clinton once said, "We cannot be one America when the whole segment of the nation has no trust in America." And if we look at the social determinants, we must acknowledge that there's gaps in healthcare disparities. And this is the social determinants are as shown: educational level, employment, housing, community resources, healthy eating, even the media. We can see how the media actually is likely to spread false lies, such as one of the lies that came out about COVID-19, or false statements, was that Black Americans could not get sick from the disease. We were actually immune. And that, however, was a story in itself. Then we have implicit racial bias, which has proved to be more powerful and a validated tool to explain healthcare disparities. So for instance, I don't know if you know, but in one study, doctors were actually giving a test, and they found that the doctors who had higher levels of implicit bias, which was measured by the implicit association test, were more likely to withhold treatment from Black patients. And then as we move forward to just last year, disparities emerging in the treatment of COVID-19. This patient here, her name is Dr. Susan Moore. It's a screenshot from a video she took while in hospital with COVID-19. She was a patient, and she said that a white doctor in the hospital in Indianapolis, where she was being treated for COVID-19, actually downplayed her complaints of pain and told her that he felt uncomfortable giving her more narcotics, and she suggested that she be discharged. Dr. Susan Moore went on, basically passed away. I think the following week he actually released her. And we also have racial disparities emerging in vaccinations. It's approximately 6% or greater American adults have received at least the first dose of COVID-19 vaccine, but that number is small as compared to them being between people. It's noted that in Mississippi, 15% of the vaccinations have been received by Black people, while that accounts for about 38% of coronavirus cases and 42% deaths in the state. So in current times, so just to give more information on what is COVID-19, so coronaviruses are basically a type of virus, right? COVID-19 actually stands for, CO stands for coronavirus, VI stands for viruses, and D stands for the disease. Scientists have been studying coronaviruses for more than 50 years. So coronaviruses is nothing new. Scientists actually had existing data on the structure, genome, and life cycle of that type of virus. And we actually call the virus that we are seeing today, which is COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, short and basically his nickname is COVID-19. And I forgot to tell you guys, 19 actually stands for the year. So it was COVID-19 was actually discovered in 2019. So SARS-CoV-2 was discovered in 2019 and has caused a worldwide pandemic in respiratory illnesses. It can trigger a respiratory tract infection. So for your upper respiratory system, you may have it can affect your sinuses, your nose, and your throat. And it can also affect your lower respiratory system, which is your windpipe and your lungs. So this is why a lot of people have a hard trouble breathing and or have to, have a hard trouble breathing, I'm sorry. And it spreads from person to person. So as we look at the rates today, we have lost at least 61,000, well, approximately 62,000 Black lives to COVID-19 today. And Black people account for at least 16% of the COVID-19 deaths where race is unknown, where race is known, I'm sorry. So as you can see here, you people by race or ethnicity, and Black Americans being the largest shown. So some of the vaccines that's out today is Pfizer and Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson just released one. The only difference between the two is the doses. One requires a 28-day, to be given 28 days apart, as the other one 21 days apart. One is 90.45% effective, the other is 95% effective, and the storage. This is actually stored at lower temperatures as compared to the Moderna. And the approval rate, the approval age is basically lower as compared to Moderna as well. So these two vaccines actually are mRNA vaccines. So mRNA vaccines actually contain material from the virus, and it causes the COVID-19 how to actually make a harmless protein, which I think is called the S protein, that is unique to the virus. So after our cells make copies of the proteins, it destroys the genetic material of the vaccine, and our bodies recognizes the protein should not be there and build T and B lymphocytes. So this will remember how to fight the virus that causes COVID-19 if we are ever infected in the future. And this shows some of the ingredients in the COVID vaccine. So of course, you have mRNA, you have a list of lipids, potassium chloride, sodium chloride, which is salt, sucrose, some sugars, and some sugars. So sucrose is just some sugars. So COVID-19 actually affects different peoples in different ways. And you can have a range of symptoms. You can have fever and chills, cough, shortness of breath, fatigue, and so on. And these symptoms may appear 2 to 4 days after exposure to the virus, or you may not have any symptoms at all. So in efforts to improve outcomes in Black Americans, we actually have more representation. We actually are represented in science. This is a picture of Dr. Corbett, an African-American woman, praised as a key scientist behind COVID-19 vaccine. She received her PhD in microbiology and immunology from UNC Chapel Hill. She's the lead scientist with the National Institutes of Health, and she actually partnered with Moderna, the pharmaceutical company that actually developed the mRNA vaccine that's greater than 90% effective. That's 90% effective. But however, we are still underrepresented in science. There are still less African Americans represented in science, but the good thing is she represented us today. So today, is there no surprise that African Americans do not trust medical professionals? Again, trust is very important. It's the foundational element. And I wrote this again. I wanted this to be shown here again so you guys can understand how important it is for us to have trust in our doctor, or have a trust in the medical professionals or the pharmaceutical professionals. So in order to address the distrust in the healthcare, we must explore the historical roots. We must explore how prejudice operates in the modern medical context. So again, trust is built in drops and lost in buckets, said Kevin Plank. And we must acknowledge the brutal history and shadow cast of the decades of discrimination and resultant collective distrust in the community. We must hold policymakers accountable for ensuring universal to a variety of social resources will prove to be effective at improving the health of Black communities. We also must hold medical schools accountable to ensure that the doctors are properly trained when integrating the concept of implicit bias and structural racism into the medical education curriculums. We also must go a step further and see that our healthcare organizations require trainings for healthcare professionals to address the explicit bias and structural racism that still exists today. Any questions?
Well, first, let me say thank you so much. That was just a wealth of information. So I can see from the chat, there was a lot of great comments being put through the chat. So we do have a couple questions. The first one is from Regis, and he said, I saw the new J&J vaccine has a 72% efficacy, which is higher than the 50% target set by health officials. Aside from only taking one shot and being able to store it at room temperature, why would one choose a less effective vaccine? Is it due to availability?
Okay, yes, it will be from my expertise, it will be due to availability. So for one, I think it's important for the elderly as well as the people who have suppressed immune systems to receive the vaccine with better efficacy. One, because their systems is will be more compromised than ours if they were to get COVID-19. However, for the younger generation whose systems are, a little bit more less suppressed, it'd be better for them to receive Johnson & Johnson and not the COVID and Pfizer due to availability. Because you got to remember, it's the world that needs it, not just the US. So this is why we're accepting multiple variations. More people are dying of COVID-19 than vaccinations.
Thank you. We have another question from Vanessa, and she says, where is the cholesterol derived from in the vaccines? I know it said no food allergens, which is what she had a concern about.
So you still should have a concern about the food allergens. That was really like a basic one, but for each vaccine, it may be different. I'm not sure where what lipids they're actually obtaining them from, where the lipids are coming from. However, I will say this, certain vaccines do have certain ingredients in it that causes allergens. So for instance, I think for the flu vaccine, they use egg protein. So you'll want to be careful when taking the flu vaccine. So this is why you see some people anaphylactic shock because they're allergic to there's a food allergen in there that they're allergic to. So I would be cautious with that personally. And you are the patient. So you have and you pay the doctor. So it's important for you to ask those questions when you go in or do your due diligence for whatever vaccine you're going to be getting to see what protein they did use, whether it came from egg or a pig, like that's important. I hope that answers your question.
No, thank you, Vanessa. Hopefully that answered your question. We have another question. Should we, in the United States, trust other countries, for instance, maybe a vaccination from Russia, saying they have a vaccination that is 90% effective? Have their studies been as accurate? Is it questionable, due to the country? Are there other countries that we should kind of trust more than others?
It's not really based on the country and then the track record of the actual pharmaceutical company as well. So reputation and character matters. So that's what I would go off of, the science. The science can't lie. It just can't. Records are records. Experimental data is experimental data. This is what we go to and we want to know what's going on, what's reported. You can actually look at the data and tell if there's skepticism. So that's what I would rely on. And most data for all these vaccines are readily available. You can look at all different phases for example, Moderna, you can look at phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, as well as for Pfizer to see what actually happened in the study and look at the data to see what occurred. So all that information is readily available to all of us.
Thank you. So you have a, not a COVID question, but someone here, Elliot has said, thank you, Dr. Brown. I'd love to understand more on environmental racism, anti-racist action in the predominantly Black neighborhoods you've studied. What are you most optimistic about in your broader scientific community, and why?
I will say, he said optimistic, right?
Yes.
I'm more optimistic about more Black faces that represent the doctors, the nurses, and the scientists. That's what I'm more optimistic about. I'm more optimistic on us listening, of us people of color, listening to people of color who are in those positions now, because now we get to see our faces. So to hear from, that was the whole point of me putting Dr. Corbett up there, because she actually helped create the vaccine. She's one of the scientists, right? So I'm more optimistic about when I have these conversations, whether it be in person, whether it be on social media, whether it be a complex like this, I'm more optimistic because you see more Black faces telling you that the history on the vaccination, or giving you details on the vaccination, or having their hands, or creating the vaccines, or giving the vaccination. So you go to a Black doctor, you know, if you feel unsafe and you feel like you're not going to be heard from your white counterparts. So that's what I'm more optimistic about. I'm more optimistic about us in the
Thank
community.
you. I have another question, which I think we all want to know. Is COVID-19 here to stay, even with vaccines being available?
Yes, it's not going anywhere. Actually, it's going to probably be another pandemic. There'll be another virus. There always will be. I mean, we had SARS already. I think it was called MERS, if I'm not mistaken, but MERS. I'm sorry that. But now we have COVID-19, and there will be another one. And COVID-19 is here to stay. I don't think we'll ever get rid of it. I mean, we can probably. The whole point of the vaccine is just to protect others that are more vulnerable than us. So that's the whole point of wearing your mask. That's the whole point of staying home, because other people's system is not as strong as ours. Me, when I say our, I'm a young person. I don't have any comorbidities. So it's important for me to protect other people whose symptoms may be less, who may be more suppressed, because the flu is still around. So COVID-19 is basically here to stay. It's not going anywhere. That's the whole point of us being vaccinated.
Okay, thank you. How can a patient choose the vaccine they receive? And that's from Sean.
I think it depends on what the hospital actually has available. And the only so if you go see a doctor, right now it's pretty hard to probably get a vaccine right now. I mean, I've even tried to call up and see like when was testing, but I think it just depends on availability. If that hospital has only Moderna, then you may have to seek another place out for Pfizer. So I think it all depends on you doing your research and seeing what hospital has the vaccine you want of choice available, and if you're able to get it at that time, because there is a waiting list. So. Yeah, it's all about you. You don't have to take the Moderna one if you don't want, but if they have the Pfizer one readily available, all you just have to tell your doctor and they should be able to give it to you.
Thank you. Regis asked also, what is being done to address these racial disparities and to restore trust in the medical system? Are health systems acknowledging the problem and making an active effort to restore the trust with Black communities? I know that's a broad question.
It really is, but I just had this conversation with someone. The only thing I can say to that is I think when he first got in office, he did write an executive plan. It's called for racial disparities equities, where he's definitely going to allocate more money to basically to study like how racism or structural implicit bias is playing a factor as in the COVID-19 actually pandemic. So he actually put people of color in those positions to actually look over that, to see if we can't get more funding in those areas. But as of now, I can't really say what we have done or what we're going to do or how we move forward. But I think that's the first step.
Thank you.
Funding.
Yes. Mateo asked, I read that vaccine efficiency or efficacy reported by government-sponsored studies tend to be lower than corporate-sponsored studies. Do you think that's a fair statement? And is 90% efficacy realistic, considering that the flu vaccine often has much lower efficacy?
Okay, repeat that question one more
Yep.
time.
So the first part is, he noted that government-sponsored studies tend to be lower than corporate-sponsored studies. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I don't know. I have to see. I can't really speak on that because I have to see what data they're actually comparing. But if you want to, I don't think Pfizer was actually sponsored by the government. They gave them no money.
Okay. And do you think a 90% efficacy is realistic, considering that the flu vaccine often has a much lower efficacy?
Yes, I think it's realistic. I mean, the data is already done. They have phase 3 trial. This data shows. So I think it's realistic. I mean, it's our only hope at this point. So I personally think it's realistic. I rely on data. So that's what I rely on. And because they have already they already finished the phase 3 trial, and it did show a 9% efficacy. Of course, it depends on certain people, but this is why we needed a vast majority of participants to actually participate in the study so that we could get great data. But based on who participated, it seems realistic.
Thank you. And then, oh, sorry, the questions are coming in hot and fast. So we only have time for a few more.
It's fine. I love talking about this. I can only give you what I have knowledge of. I really don't like to, yeah, sure. Come on, bring on the questions.
Okay. Excel asked, do you have more insight on how psychologists are helping to close the gap caused by generational trauma of medical exploitation of Black bodies?
It's actually a good question. I really don't, but I think they actually could help out more with how we can move forward with bridging the gap between African Americans and the medical industry, because we do still have that hurt there. I mean, we do still have those not only images, but that history embedded in us, where even going back to the ski study, where we still think like, oh, we don't trust the government because they were supposed to heal us at this point or treat us at that point, and they never did. So even with the media stating like, hey, we need more Black people or more African Americans to take the vaccine or sign up for these studies, they feel like they're being called out as experiment lab rats. So yeah, I think psychology actually will help, therapy as well too, because we are some people, or I'm not even gonna say this way, especially towards the government, because of the past history. And I think psychology could actually help in determining how we can not fix, but help the problem. Because it's going to take a lot more experts.
Do you know if we will need to take the COVID-19 vaccine annually like the flu shot? That's from Denise.
Maybe so, because I only say that because the antibodies can only, I think from studies, it actually show that when people did not take the vaccine, right, and you actually caught COVID-19, you actually build up the antibodies, but over time, they actually decline in your body. So I think you will have to take it annually.
Okay.
And enough research, just to put that out there, enough research has not been done to state whether you have to take it annually or not, because they trials last year. So this year you'll probably get more information on why, if you'll need to take it annually as well, because we're rolling over to a year this year.
Got it.
Yes.
So just have 2 more questions. One's from Shannon. Shannon Hill, what happens if you choose one of the vaccines that require 2 doses and you can only get one due to limited access or production? Is there a side effect or a permanent effect due to limited resources?
A side effect on your body or a side effect on the overall?
I
Yes,
would guess maybe a side effect on the efficacy, like if you don't get both shots.
yes, there is. So basically, if you don't get both shots, because basically I talked about this earlier when I said some vaccinations require 2 doses. So it can basically have your immune recognize or build your antibodies up in your body, right? And that's basically what 2 vaccinations are needed for. And this is why they're separated 2 different days, because they have already done the science or experiments to show that, hey, you need a second dose to actually boost your antibodies or produce more antibodies for that specific pathogen. So it's important that you will have to get that second dose, or you'll have to start all over again.
Got it.
Why the government basically said it's important for us to roll out all the doses, because it's the same amount. You're getting the same amount. It's no difference if you it's no difference in the amount of drug you're taking. It's the same, or vaccine you're taking. It's the same amount. So the first time, the second time, same amount. We're just trying to produce more antibodies in your body.
Thank you so much. That concludes our questions. Kivon, any closing words?
Sorry, just needed to get off mute. We would just like to thank you sincerely, Dr. Brown, for coming and speaking with us today about vaccinations and about the history of vaccinations. It's very important to know and understand the history so that we can move forward. And we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to really come and discuss this topic with us.
No problem. And if anybody has any other questions that you wanted to ask and did not feel as of now was the right time to do so, you feel free to email me. I don't mind talking about it. I love educating people on these subjects. So I educate myself the more I read as well. So COVID-19 is new to all of us. I understand that all of us are scared, but if I could leave you with anything, stay safe, continue to wear your mask, actually double up if you don't have an N95. And 7% more transmissible. So, continue to wash your hands and continue to stay safe, 6 feet apart. You guys, life is valuable. I love you if nobody else told you that today. And I thank you for having me.
Thank you so, so much, Dr. Brown. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining this Black History Month event. Have a great day.
Thank you, Melissa.